There's this very specific feeling I get, and I bet you get it too.
Oh, I'm sure I do.
Yeah, it's when you're just scrolling through your feed and suddenly that breaking news banner flashes up.
Right.
It's usually a van driving into a crowd or maybe shooting at a beach resort or something exploding in a subway. And my immediate gut level reaction is always just, this is pure chaos.
It feels completely random.
Exactly. It feels like the world has just snapped. Like it's just senseless madness.
Which is the totally natural human reaction, by the way. I mean, we constantly try to impose order on the world, and terrorism feels like the ultimate disorder.
Right. But then, once that initial shock wears off, I always start to wonder, is it actually chaos? Or are we just looking at a blueprint that we don't understand?
That is the big question.
Right. Like, is modern terrorism just a bunch of angry people snapping? Or is it a calculated industrial machine that has fundamentally changed the physics of how the world works?
It's the latter. And if we look at the stack of sources we have for today's deep dive, the answer is pretty unsettling, honestly. It suggests that what looks like chaos to us is actually a highly specific, highly structured type of warfare.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking today. We have a really fascinating and frankly slightly terrifying combination of sources. We're anchoring this with a dense geopolitical analysis from a 2010 book called La Yihad Global, or Global Jihad, by Professor George Karim Chaya.
Which is a real heavy hitter of a text. I mean, Chaya dives incredibly deep into the philosophy, the financing, and the operational structure of 21st century terrorism.
Yeah, he really does. And to keep us grounded in reality, we are pairing that high-level theory with actual forensic case studies from a criminology course on criminal profiling and radicalization.
So we get the theory and the practice.
Exactly. We're going from the abstract philosophy of this clash of cultures straight down to the crime scene tape in London and Tunisia.
It's a really powerful mix because you really need both to grasp this. You need to understand the why and the money trail, but you also need to look at the how, the mechanics, to really get the full picture of what we're dealing with.
So our mission today, for everyone listening, is to move beyond the headlines. We want to understand the actual machinery of global jihadism. We want to see how a philosophical idea turns into a gritty, tragic reality on a city sidewalk.
And to do that, we have to start by shifting our mindset right out of the gate. We need to stop looking at this merely as a crime and start understanding it as a conflict.
A conflict.
Yeah,
Really?
specifically what military strategists call asymmetric conflict.
Okay, before we get into the heavy tactics of asymmetric conflict, I want to start with something that honestly frustrated me when I was reading Chaya's text.
The definition issue.
Yes, the definitions. He points out that the international community, the UN, the FBI, the State Department, the EU, they can't even agree on what the word terrorism actually means.
It sounds completely absurd, doesn't it?
It does. You would think it would be the easiest definition in the world. I mean, if someone blows up a bus full of civilians, that's terrorism. Why do we need a committee to define that?
Because definitions carry massive legal, military, and diplomatic weight. It's that old adage, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter.
Right.
If you define it too broadly on an international level, you might accidentally criminalize a legitimate rebellion against a brutal dictator.
Oh, I see.
But if you define it too narrowly, you let state-sponsored murderers completely off the hook. But Chaya cuts through a lot of the noise here. He offers a distinction that I think is incredibly useful for us. He separates the terrorist from the guerrilla.
Okay, break that down for us, because in the news, those terms get swapped around constantly.
They do, but think about the ultimate objective. A guerrilla fighter usually acts like a mini army. They wear uniforms, they have a clear rank structure, and most importantly, they try to capture and hold territory.
So they want to literally take the hill.
Exactly. They want that hill, they want that town, and they generally fight against other armed forces.
So it's military versus military mostly.
Mostly, yes. But a terrorist, they don't want the hill. They really don't care about holding territory in the traditional military sense. Their primary target is the civilian, the non-combatant.
Right.
And the goal isn't a military victory on the battlefield. It's a psychological victory in your head. They want to create a level of fear that vastly outweighs the actual material damage of the attack.
So the fear itself is the weapon. The bomb is just the delivery system for the fear.
Precisely. The violence is just a message. And this leads to what Chaya calls the Orwellian manipulation of language. This is where the battle isn't fought with guns, but with dictionaries.
I circled this section multiple times in the source. He talks about building an emotional infrastructure for violence.
That is such a key concept. Emotional infrastructure. Think about the vocabulary we hear on the news. If a 19-year-old kid walks into a pizza parlor and detonates a vest, that is, objectively speaking, a murder-suicide.
Right.
But if the organization that sent him rebrands him as a martyr,
Suddenly he's a hero to his community.
right. And if you call a terror cell a political wing or a mastermind, a spiritual leader, you are completely sanitizing the violence.
Wow.
Chaya argues that this isn't just sloppy media reporting or PR. It's a core strategic layer of the machine. If you control the language, you can build a narrative where killing civilians looks like a noble act of resistance.
It creates a permission structure.
Exactly. It allows the machinery to operate without the local population revolting against it.
But here's the thing. Narratives are great, but narratives don't pay the bills.
No, they don't.
You can't buy C4 explosives with emotional infrastructure. You can't rent a safe house in London or buy a fleet of trucks with just rhetoric.
No, you need cold, hard cash. And a lot of it.
This was the part of Chaya's analysis that I found the most eye-opening. I think we have this Hollywood image of terrorism financing.
Right.
You know, a shady guy with a briefcase full of cash meeting in a dark parking garage.
The movie villain trope?
Exactly. But Chaya outlines this concentric circles theory, and it sounds way more corporate.
It is highly systemic. Imagine a target board. In the center, the bullseye, you have the inner circle. These are the operatives, the guys you actually see on the news. They need cash for travel, weapons, fake passports, and just daily living expenses.
Okay, so that's the visible cost of doing business, the tip of the iceberg.
Right, but surrounding them is the middle circle. These are the planners, the commanders, the preachers, and ideologues. And Chaya makes a really striking point here that contradicts a lot of our basic assumptions.
That they're hiding out in harsh conditions.
Yeah, he points out that these people aren't living in caves, they aren't suffering, they often live very comfortably, managing the violence from a very safe distance.
But where does the money come from to support that lifestyle and the operations?
That brings us to the outer circle. And according to Chaya, this is the most insidious layer by far because it hides in plain sight. This circle is made up of charities, NGOs, and humanitarian organizations.
Wait, hold on. You're saying legitimate charities. That sounds a bit like a conspiracy theory.
Well, legitimate is the mask. On the surface, yes, they look completely real. They might run schools, feed the poor, build medical clinics. And this buys them immense loyalty from the local population. I mean, if you're hungry and someone feeds you, you listen to them.
Naturally.
But Chaya argues that while they are feeding bodies, they are, to use his exact phrase, washing brains.
So the charity is essentially a front.
It's a dual-use pipeline. They funnel a portion of the donations to the inner circle for weapons and logistics, but they use the rest to run radical madrasas, which are schools that actively indoctrinate the next generation.
So they're building the future workforce.
Exactly. The outer circle ensures that when the current bomber dies, there are 3 more young men graduating ready to take his place.
This brings up a huge point of contention for me. I've always heard, and honestly I think I've probably said this myself at dinner parties, that terrorism is driven by poverty. You know, desperate people doing desperate things.
It's a very common belief in the West.
Right, because the logic is, if we just solve poverty, surely we solve terrorism. But Chaya seems to completely disagree with that premise.
He dismantles that idea pretty aggressively. And he uses pure data to do it. He asks a very simple question. If terrorism is caused by poverty, why is Africa historically the poorest continent, not the primary exporter of international suicide terrorism?
Wow.
Why was the epicenter, for so long, the Middle East, which is comparatively much wealthier?
That is actually a really difficult point to argue with.
He also points to the profiles of the attackers themselves. Desperation doesn't supply you with the complex logistics needed for a coordinated international attack. That requires capital.
And education, usually.
Exactly. And the leaders. Osama bin Laden was a millionaire. The planners in that middle circle are often quite well off. They absolutely use the poor as foot soldiers, certainly. But the primary driver isn't economics, it's ideology.
And that leads us directly to the cultural clash. This part of source material was honestly a bit uncomfortable to read. Chaya talks about cultural entities.
It is controversial, yes, but it's totally crucial to his entire argument. He moves away from the traditional Westphalian idea of nation-states fighting each other, like Germany versus France.
Right. Lines on a map.
Exactly. He suggests we are in a period where the conflict is between Western culture and radicalize Islamic entities that simply do not respect borders. They don't see themselves as Syrians or Saudis first. They see themselves as part of a transnational entity.
And he makes this counterintuitive point about democracy. We usually think in the West, if we just bring democracy to the region, peace will naturally follow. That has literally been the foreign policy playbook for 20 years.
It has.
But Jaya says, not necessarily.
He calls it a democratic paradox. We assume that if people vote, they'll inevitably vote for liberal Western-style peace. But look at groups like Hamas. They won elections. Hezbollah operates within a parliamentary system.
Right, they use this system.
Chaya argues that in some cases, democracy simply gives these radical cultural entities a perfectly legitimate platform to organize and mobilize against the West.
So if you're a Western government, this is an absolute nightmare. You're fighting something that isn't a country, that hides behind humanitarian charities, and uses your own democratic values against you. How do you even begin to respond to that?
Well, this is exactly where we see the massive shift from law enforcement to war. And this is a really key takeaway for you listening. Before 9/11, terrorism was largely treated as a criminal justice issue. Someone bombs a building, you send the FBI, you collect forensic evidence, and you try to put them on trial.
But that's entirely reactive. You're just cleaning up the mess after people are already dead.
Exactly. And Chaya argues that post 9/11, that model simply broke. The threat was too high. So states moved to a preventative model, relying heavily on intelligence and military action. You cannot wait for the crime to happen. You have to disrupt the plot before the bomb is even built.
This is where that term asymmetric war comes back into the picture. Can we define that clearly? Because it gets thrown around a lot in military jargon on the news.
Sure, think of it like physics. Symmetric war is army versus army, tank versus tank.
Equal forces.
Right. Asymmetric war is when a small, relatively weak force attacks the weak points of a massive, powerful force. If you can't beat the U.S. Army on a traditional battlefield, which you really can't, you just bypass the army entirely.
You've attacked the civilian.
You attack their civilians, their subways, their basic sense of everyday safety.
You pack where they aren't looking.
Exactly. And because the asymmetric fighters don't play by the traditional Geneva rules of war, it creates these massive ethical and tactical dilemmas for the state. The source material lists some really brutal scenarios like, what does a democratic state do when terrorists purposefully hide their headquarters in a hospital?
Or when they use an ambulance to transport a bomb.
Right.
Or use children as human shields.
It's a literal trap. If the state attacks the hospital to get the terror cell, they look like absolute monsters on the global stage. They lose the PR war, and the terrorist group gets an amazing recruiting poster for the outer circle.
But if they don't attack?
If they don't attack, the terrorists get away and live to kill again. It feels like an impossible lose-lose situation.
So what is the solution? Does a state just ignore the hospital?
No, but Chaya emphasizes that you cannot fight this kind of war with just airstrikes. You can't bomb an ideology. And you can't bomb a hospital without losing the moral high ground that you need to win the broader cultural clash.
So what's the alternative?
He argues incredibly strongly for human intelligence. You need spies. You need people deep inside those networks on the ground who can distinguish the actual terrorist from the civilian doctor. Because a drone flying at 10,000 feet cannot see into the mind of a cell leader. You need scalpel precision, not brute force.
Okay, we've talked a lot of theory so far. We've mapped out the circles of financing and the heavy philosophy of conflict. But I want to switch gears and look at what this actually looks like on the ground. We have these criminology course notes that detail specific attacks. And honestly, reading through them, the detail is heavy. It stops being abstract really fast.
It really does. But I think we absolutely have to look at it. We have to connect Chaya's asymmetric war theory to the grim reality on the pavement. We have two main case studies from the course material here. The London Bridge attack in 2017 and the attack in Tunisia at the Hotel Riu Imperial.
Let's start with London, June 3, 2017.
This is a textbook example of low-tech asymmetric warfare. You have 3 attackers. They don't have military missiles. They don't have an armored tank. They have a standard rental van.
Which literally anyone can get for $50.
Exactly. They drive right onto the sidewalk on London Bridge, deliberately ramming pedestrians. Then they get out, armed not with sophisticated military gear, but with simple kitchen knives taped to their wrists. And they head straight into the crowded Borough Market.
It's terrifying purely because of the banality of it. A van and a kitchen knife. These are everyday objects that we all use.
And that is exactly the point of the asymmetric strategy. The source includes images of the aftermath. The van crashed. emergency services swarming the area. 8 innocent people died, 48 were severely injured. But the strategic goal wasn't just the final casualty count.
It was the disruption.
It was to shut down a major world capital. They turned a normal Saturday night out into a war zone. It fits perfectly with Chaya's definition. The primary goal was fear. You don't need a nuclear weapon to paralyze a modern city. You just need to weaponize daily life.
And then you have the Tunisia attack, the Hotel Rio Imperial in Sousse. This one felt very different to me when reading the notes. It wasn't in a busy, chaotic city center. It was at a tranquil beach resort.
This is a calculated attack on the softest of soft targets. A gunman armed with a Kalashnikov, disguised as a normal tourist, walks right onto a private beach. The source material has these incredibly jarring photos.
Yeah, those were hard to look at.
Beach chairs, colorful towels, sun umbrellas, and bodies covered in white sheets.
It's that jarring juxtaposition of pure leisure and sudden horror that really gets to you. People were literally there just to relax.
And that's exactly why that specific location was chosen. The tactical goal wasn't just murder, it was calculated economic warfare.
Because of the tourism.
Right. Tunisia relies heavily on European tourism. By turning a luxury holiday resort into a slaughterhouse, the terrorists effectively sanctioned the entire country's economy. Tourists stopped coming out of fear, hotels closed down. Thousands of jobs were lost.
Which instantly creates local instability.
Which creates deep poverty. Which, even if it's not the root cause of terrorism, certainly helps the recruiters in that outer circle we talked about. They can go to those newly unemployed young men and say, look, the West abandoned you, your government failed you, come join us. It's a deliberate self-feeding cycle.
Speaking of recruitment and fighters, there was this one side note in the criminology text that I found really surprising. It didn't fit the usual media narrative at all. The case of Camarade Mardos.
Ah, yes, the Spanish communist.
Yeah, a 21-year-old Spanish guy who traveled to Syria and Iraq.
Yeah.
But he didn't go to join ISIS. He went to fight against ISIS, alongside the Kurdish militias.
It adds such a fascinating layer of complexity to the whole foreign fighter phenomenon. Usually we just think of foreign fighters as radicals traveling to join the jihad. But here you have a guy motivated by Marxism-Leninism, a totally different ideology, going to the exact same battlefield.
But here's the kicker from the case study. When he finally comes back to Spain, his home country, he gets arrested.
He does. And this brings us right back to that fundamental definition problem we started the whole deep dive with. The group he fought with, the Kurds fighting ISIS, are often considered vital allies of the West on the ground in Syria.
Right.
But because of their historical affiliations with the PKK, they are also officially labeled as a terrorist organization by the EU and the US.
So he's fighting the so-called bad guys. But legally, he's also considered a bad guy.
Exactly. It shows just how messy this definition dilemma really is in practice. You have a guy fighting terrorists, but he's aligned with a group also labeled as terrorists by his own government. It highlights that this isn't just a simple black and white movie with clear good guys and bad guys. It's a tangled, contradictory web of global actors where enemy and ally can literally shift depending on who happens to be writing the law that day.
So we've seen the murky definitions, the complex money trails, the ethical nightmares for democracies, and the truly tragic reality on the ground. Where does that actually leave us? Because reading Chaya's conclusion, it did not feel very hopeful.
It's not hopeful, no, but he would strongly argue it is realistic. He suggests that the West needs a major paradigm shift. For a long time, we operated on the idea of conflict resolution.
The idea that we can fix it.
Right, the idea that if we just sit down at a table, sign a diplomatic treaty, maybe give back some land, we can solve the core problem and everyone goes home happy.
And Chaya thinks that's totally naive.
He thinks it's completely obsolete in this context. He argues we are moving, or really have already moved, into a permanent era of conflict management.
What's the core difference there?
Resolution means the problem eventually goes away. Management means you accept that the conflict simply is the new state of the world. You accept that this clash of cultures is a reality, and you manage the violence. You contain it. You try to minimize it. But you don't delude yourself into thinking you can permanently fix it with a political handshake.
That is a pretty bleak outlook for the future. It sounds like a forever war.
It is deeply pragmatic, though. He predicts that traditional deals like Land for Peace simply won't work with groups whose core ideology is maximalist.
I'm getting they want everything.
Meaning they want the total destruction of the other side. You can't logically negotiate with someone who believes your very existence is an affront to their worldview. He calls for a united Western front, Europe and the Americas to face this cultural entity together. Not necessarily to convert them, but simply to withstand them.
It really forces you to rethink how we approach international relations. It's less West Wing diplomacy and more the wire survival tactics. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a thought that just kept nagging at me while we were reading through that three circles theory.
I think I know exactly where you're going with this.
If the outer circle, the charities, the schools, the educational systems, if that is the layer actively radicalizing the next generation, and if that circle is where the money is really coming from, why does it feel like 90% of the international effort is focused purely on the inner circle?
You mean the guys with the guns?
Exactly. We spend billions of dollars fighting the guys with the guns. We send in drones, special forces, massive armies. But are we just endlessly trimming the branches while secretly watering the roots?
That is the ultimate provocative question.
Right, because if the emotional infrastructure and the quiet financing remain totally untouched in that outer circle, aren't we just guaranteeing a brand new crop of fighters for the next 20 years?
Dealing with the inner circle gives governments immediate, tangible results. A bad guy is neutralized. You can put that on a PowerPoint slide for the press.
It looks like winning.
Exactly. But dealing with the outer circle requires confronting strategic allies, questioning foreign educational curriculums, and following money trails that might lead directly into legitimate global banks and friendly governments. It's much, much harder. It's politically incredibly dangerous, but ultimately it might be the only actual way to stop the machine from running.
Something for you to think about the next time you see a breaking news headline and think it's just random chaos. There's always a machine behind it.
Always.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, stay critical.
And keep looking at the bigger picture.